Welcome, everybody. We are so grateful that you are all here. My name is Dr. Colin Swearingen. I'm in the Department of Political Science, and this is really the first time we're doing this with Pete when he's here is an opportunity for our pre-law students, our Law and Society minors, and those interested in going to law school to network with alumni. As you might have noted, if you've been talking to some of our students, they really do have a lot of questions about law school, what it's like to get in, how do you navigate law school once you're in, and so we do have quite a few alumni who are able to help with that. But of course, we also want to provide some fun academic discourse, and to help us with that, we have this man here on my right, your left, and I feel like he needs no introduction at John Carroll, but just in case you have not been here for any of our wonderful events over the last couple of years, Pete Williams is a longtime journalist at NBC News who covered the Supreme Court and the Department of Justice. Of course, before then, he was spokesperson for the Defense Department. He worked in the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, and is a Stanford alum. I also love getting to just know more about Pete, including some just tidbits from his life. Last night, when we had dinner with Kelly O'Donnell, he calls her K.O.
Well, those are her initials, Kelly O'Donnell.
But I think of a boxer,
okay.
And I thought there was some deeper meaning in that.
Fits too.
Yeah,
that
I was going to say, that probably fits too.
Knockout. And she is one, so there you are.
She was wonderful last night. I hope some of you were able to make that. If not, well, next time we have Pete back and we have anybody else here, you should come to our events because they do a fantastic job. So we're here to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court and some of the legal issues that are going on right now. And so, Pete, I want to ask you about how this current term that's ending has been dominated by the emergency or the shadow docket. Why is that?
Yeah, and this current term actually ends next Monday. So the shadow docket has totally dominated. You know, you can ask yourself, how well did President Trump do this term? And the answer is very well. Very well on what's called the shadow or interim or emergency docket. And if you don't know, the difference is that in the regular course of a case coming to the Supreme Court, you have 2 rounds of briefings, you have oral argument, and then the justices take months and months to decide the opinion. They debate it among themselves, it goes through constant refinement, and then finally it comes out. So it's a very slow, deliberative, careful process. As opposed to the emergency docket, where there's a simple 1 round of briefs, no oral argument, the justices often don't talk to each other about it, out comes the opinion, and it usually is simply an order. So most of these cases come to the Supreme Court because the Trump administration has signed an executive order. It gets put on hold by the lower courts. The Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to lift that stay so they can go ahead and enforce it. So it comes to the Supreme Court with a very narrow question, which is, can we enforce this for a while it's still working its way through the lower courts? So it's a very narrow legal issue. And the Supreme Court usually just puts an order out saying, yep, we'll lift the stay, or no, we won't, and that's usually about it. So we don't know much about why the justices are doing what they're doing. They typically don't really explain much about it. There's rules in the federal courts for how judges are supposed to evaluate these requests to lift stays. How likely is the government to win when the case comes back? How much would the government be harmed if the executive order remains on hold? By contrast, how much would the other parties be harmed if it goes into effect? And then there's supposed to be a balancing. Well, the court, if it is engaged in that sort of analysis, hasn't really told us much. To give you an idea of the magnitude and the sort of flurry of which these have come to the court, here's the data. In the entire George Bush administration, they sought emergency relief from the Supreme Court 5 times. Obama 3 times, Biden 19, Trump 41, and in the current term, this is just in the past few months, 28 times. So they're filing these things like mad. Now, how is Trump doing with these? Well, you probably know some of the victories he's had, and he's had more victories than he's had defeats. The Supreme Court has allowed him to fire board members or commissioners from independent agencies simply because he doesn't like their policies. He doesn't have to show cause. He doesn't have to say they're not doing their job properly, they're not showing up for work, it's malfeasance. I just don't like them. They're not my cup of tea. I want them out. He can do that. It allowed Doge members to have access to Social Security data. They said he could carry out mass firings of federal government employees, ban transgender people from joining or remaining in the military, terminate millions of dollars worth of teacher grants, conduct mass immigration raids in workplaces or in Los Angeles or places where workers congregate, cancel grants from the National Institute of Health. In most of these cases, the vote was 6-3. I would just make a couple of other points about this. First of all these rulings, as I said, are at the preliminary stages. They come to the courts because the government says, oh, you went to the wrong court or below, or you cited the wrong law or whatever. These are very narrow, sort of fly-specky decisions by the Supreme Court. The court is avoiding taking the Trump administration on the merits. Now, that's not going to last because some of these cases are now coming back on the merits. But for the moment, they seem to be eager not to fully engage the Trump administration on these executive orders. By contrast, they haven't endorsed these executive orders either. So they're trying to do the very minimum that they can in handling these cases. The second point is that the government is being very choosy about, this may seem like a lot of emergency appeals, but there are many hundreds of lawsuits in the lower courts, and they're not appealing most of them to the Supreme Court. So they've been picking and choosing their battles, and they've picked pretty wisely. And then, of course, Trump has lost some. The court said he can't deport a group of Venezuelans that the administration said were members of a violent gang, citing something called the Alien Enemies Act. The Supreme Court didn't care for that much. It said you really have to go bring Kilmar Abrego Garcia back. This is after the administration sent him to El Salvador against a lower court order that said you can't do that. The administration said, we can't do anything about it now. He's no longer in the U.S. He's outside our jurisdiction. Magically, they did find a way to bring him back, and they brought him back and immediately charged him with another crime, of course. And then finally, birthright citizenship. It came up to the Supreme Court. This is the part of the question about whether children born on American soil are citizens even if their parents are not. And the understanding since the last century has been that, yes, they are citizens. Mr. Trump signed an executive order saying, no, they shouldn't be allowed to be citizens. It came up to the Supreme Court on a very, very narrow question, which is, can lower court judges issue nationwide injunctions and put the thing on hold nationwide? And the Supreme Court, which has dodged this question of nationwide injunctions for several years, finally said, yep, judges can't issue nationwide injunctions. But they said nothing about birthright citizenship itself. However, that question has now come back to the Supreme Court. The Justice Department just recently asked the court to take the case. Two things are interesting about that. One is that their appeal to the Supreme Court this time was not on the emergency docket. They didn't ask for expedited review. So I think they did this fully understanding that they're probably not going to win. But when the case was argued the first time, the Solicitor General said, look, I promise if you strike down nationwide injunctions, I'll come back. So he's keeping his promise to come back, but it would appear without much expectation that he's going to win.
I want to go back to the nationwide injunction mention that you had. Do you think that's going to change some of the lower court decisions moving forward? Is that going to be something that they honor from the Supreme Court?
Well, here's the thing about nationwide injunctions. If all the court does is say, we're lifting the stay, go ahead and enforce the order, what kind of guidance is that to the lower courts? None. But the Supreme Court in a couple of cases have said to the lower courts, well, you're not following our precedent. It's left lower court judges pretty confused about this. It's created some dissension within the court about exactly what, if anything, these these emergency court decisions mean to the lower courts. It's confused the judges, it's caused some bad feelings, and I will just get technical for just a moment. Back when Franklin Roosevelt was president, he tried to fire someone from the Federal Trade Commission because he said, you know, I just don't like this guy's politics. Well, the law that created the Federal Trade Commission said that members of the FTC could only be fired for cause. The FDR said, you know, that's a restriction on my authority. I'm going to go ahead and fire them. And the Supreme Court, in a case that lawyers love to call Humphrey's Executor, because that's the name of the case, said no, the president can't do that. He cannot fire people where Congress has said they can only be fired for cause. Well, the Supreme Court just recently issued an executive order saying go ahead and fire a member of the Federal Trade Commission, exactly the same commission involved in the FTC case, making it pretty clear that the Supreme Court is going to overturn Humphrey's Executor and do away with that restriction on the president's power. Elena Kagan, in her dissent, said, wait a minute, you shouldn't be overturning precedents in these emergency orders. So these emergency orders are bearing a lot of weight. And the other thing I will say is just this, you know, the justices hate this term shadow docket, which was coined by Will Vaught, a law professor, because they said it, you know, makes it sound like we're mysterious and no one knows what we're up to. Justice Kavanaugh the other day said the right term is interim docket. Well, yeah, except if you're one of those federal employees who got fired, it isn't very interim. And if you're one of the Venezuelans that the government wants to deport, it isn't very interim. If you're someone that the government wants to deport to a third country that the president has claimed the power to do under his executive orders, that's not very interim. Or shutting down the Agency for International Development, or doing away with the Department of Education. I mean, these are more than just interim standby for later details kind of decisions.
So we've talked a lot about the executive orders. I want to actually move on to one of arguably the few laws that Congress has passed these days, which is check up. It was on, but not fully on. So we've talked a lot about executive orders. I want to talk about one of the few laws that Congress has passed recently, and that is the TikTok law. Now, I find this fascinating. As students know, I'm a huge fan of Article 1 of the Constitution. Pete always ribs me for that being an aspirational thing at this point. But it was a law passed by Congress that gave certain commands of here's how TikTok needs to work if it's going to work here in the United States. The Trump administration has not executed that law, right? So there's some confusion over that. And what is the court saying about this? Because the court, I believe, has weighed in on this already.
Well, so what Congress said is that TikTok must be banned in the United States unless you can find a buyer that where the buyer is not China or some other foreign adversary. And if the president thinks that a deal is imminent, he can forestall enforcement of the ban for 90 days, but he can only do it once, says the law passed by Congress. President Trump has put it on hold 4 times in clear violation of the law. And you know, he's recently announced that there's a deal for some American buyers to take over TikTok. But that's not the worst of it, I think, Colin. Yes, he clearly ignored the law 4 times. Congress, which passed the law, apparently was out of town every time that he did that because they haven't raised a peep about it. But here's, I think, the worst part of it. Not only did the president ignore that part of it and just said, well, okay, the law says I can only do it once. Guess what? I'm going to do it 4 times. I think one of the reasons there wasn't much of a peep is that it's a pretty popular program and it has millions and millions of users in the US. But here's the worst of it. The Justice Department sent letters to the US tech companies that bring TikTok to a smartphone near you. And it said, You will not face any legal consequences if you violate the law and continue to make TikTok available. Never mind that inconvenient federal law. Just go ahead, and we promise you will face no problems whatsoever. And in signing these letters to the tech companies, the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, said this. She said that the president has determined that abruptly shutting down TikTok would interfere with the president's, quote, national security and foreign affairs powers. So in other words, this letter amounted to a claim that a president can just immunize anyone from the consequences of a criminal violation. She didn't say anything, you all talked about Article 1. She didn't talk about that inconvenient thing in Article 2 that said the president shall take care that laws be fully executed. She seemed to imply that presidents have the same authority that English kings once had to simply dispense with laws that they find inconvenient. And that's clearly what he did, and it's pretty shocking.
So you mentioned national security, and tariffs are a hot-button issue. We're going to actually talk more about tariffs on Thursday night with Daniel DeRocher, who's going to be coming here. He's from Politico, and he's an expert in that. But Pete, for our audience tonight, tariffs, he's using national security and emergency powers for that as well, which undermines, again, what Congress has done. Again, Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the powers to be in charge of these things, and he's going, and specifically a law that Congress passed dealing with South Korea in particular. What's going on with it? How is he justifying this, and what are the courts doing?
Okay, so you may remember that the president announced a series of tariffs for two reasons. One is he said he wanted to punish Canada and Mexico for, he said they weren't doing enough to stop the flow of fentanyl across the border, which is, causing a serious drug problem. But the other, he said is the other countries had just have been mean to us on the international balance of payments. And it's high time that we exact some tariffs to set the trade thing on more level footing. And in doing all of this, he cited something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which I will call IEPA, so I don't have to keep saying all of that. That's a law passed by Congress in 1977, and here's what it says. It says, quote, in dealing with an unusual or extraordinary overseas threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States, the president can regulate foreign imports. So that's the key to the legal case. What does regulate mean? The president and the administration say, well, that gives him free rein. Imposing tariffs is just another way to regulate imports. The businesses and states that have sued the Trump administration over these tariffs say, you know what, if you look in IEPA, the word tariff isn't there. There's nothing in the statute gives the authority to the president to impose tariffs. The word tariff isn't there, nor is any synonym for the word tariff. And the other thing that the main court that considered this did, which I thought was rather crafty, it was an appeal to the conservatives on the Supreme Court. That court was well aware that in the Biden administration, the Supreme Court said, you know what, President Biden cannot forgive or suspend or alter the payment schedule for student loans because that's going to have enormous economic consequences. And whenever Congress or whenever the president does something like that has huge political or economic consequences, he can only do that if Congress has explicitly given him that authority. They referred to this as a judge-made legal concept. They called it the major questions doctrine. And they imposed it to stop the president from doing several other things in the Biden administration. So the Court of Appeals to handle the tariffs case was pretty crafty here. I think in an appeal to the conservatives on the Supreme Court, they said, well, these tariffs violate the major questions doctrine because we're talking about trillions of dollars worth of foreign trade. That's certainly a major question. So those are the two basis on which the Supreme Court will take the case. And then, of course, there's the other question of whether, remember, this says in unusual or extraordinary overseas threat. So is a trade imbalance that's been going on for decades an emergency? That's another basis on which the Supreme Court could rule against it.
I mean, so on this issue, I've been reading legal commentators on both the ideological left and right, and they all seem to be in agreement that this is a losing case for the Trump administration. But is it really going to be that open shut of a decision by the Supreme Court?
I wouldn't put any money on it. I mean, the Trump administration has made the argument that all hell will break loose if the Supreme Court says you can't have these tariffs. For one thing, the question is, well, do we have to pay the money back that we've collected in tariffs? The Treasury Secretary says we would have to pay at least half of it back. We're talking billions of dollars here. The administration says these tariffs have been the key that have opened the door to lots of other agreements with foreign countries. All that goes out the window if you take the tariffs away from us. And then the other argument is this. If you say that in an emergency, the president could say, you know what, China is a threat, so I'm going to shut off all trade with China. I'm going to just close it down. No more trade. Well, I don't think anyone would argue that he can't do that under IEPA. So the argument from the supporters of the president says, well, imposing tariffs to restrict the goods is certainly less onerous than shutting them off altogether, so that he must have that power. If he has this power, he must have a lesser power. So, and then there's the whole question of whether it's an emergency. I think it's probable that the Supreme Court could say, you know what, the president probably can impose some of these tariffs, just not all of them. Maybe he can impose the ones that are, slightly higher than current, but he can't go, 200% higher. They might remand the case to say, take another look, and maybe there's some of these tariffs can be upheld. So, I think the odds that it's a total shutout, he loses 100% are remote. I think the odds that he wins completely are somewhat less remote, and some kind of a decision somewhere in the middle where he wins a little, loses a little, seems to me a more likely outcome.
And I'm glad you say that. I mean, more that we can talk about with this issue, which we'll discuss Thursday with Daniel DeRocher. But you mentioned earlier the transgender issue, and can you tell, especially for the students and others that haven't been following along with that, a little bit about that decision, and then what might be coming up in the next term on that issue?
So the transgender issue the Supreme Court decided in the past term was a state law in Tennessee that said you cannot give conversion therapy drugs, hormone blockers, and so forth to minors. That law was challenged by opponents who said, well, wait a minute. You can give those drugs to people who aren't undergoing conversion to minors. You just won't give them to minors undergoing conversion, and therefore it's unconstitutional, it's discrimination. What the Supreme Court said is basically, you know what? This whole question about medical conversion therapy is a very unsettled one. Look at what some of the countries overseas who initially embraced this, now they're backing away from it. These are questions that really are the province of state medical boards, and we're not going to shut Tennessee down. So that's the decision from the Supreme Court in the past term. There are two transgender issues coming up in the current term that the court has agreed to hear. The first is a challenge to Colorado's state law that bans conversion therapy. Now, we're not talking about medical therapy, we're talking about counseling kind of therapy. That's giving someone therapy to try to talk them into changing, abandoning their plans to transgender, to transition is banned. And the opponents are saying, well, the lead plaintiff here is saying that this violates her religious freedom because She often she often uses a religious experience to talk to young patients about this, and this is a violation of her religious and First Amendment freedoms. So the Supreme Court will take that case up. And then the second one is the really hot button issue about whether transgender athletes can compete on girls and women's sports teams. There are laws from two states. These cases come from two states. One is West Virginia, the other is Idaho. One involves a high school student, one involves a college student, and both of them are challenging these laws, saying that they violate not only the Constitution, but also Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, which requires equality in sports. Ohio is one of the 27 states that has this kind of a ban on transgender young people in school athletic programs. The NCAA has it, of course, in collegiate sports. And the states are saying that male athletes simply have physical characteristics that put them at an unfair advantage. They're stronger, they have denser bones, they have bigger hearts and lungs, and for all that reason, it's a bad idea.
So in my U.S. politics class, I have a number of students who are education majors. And so one of the topics that comes up regularly when we talk about current issues is education. And here in Ohio, of course, we have a legislature that has passed increasingly spending money on school choice programs. And one of the decisions from this past term dealt with taxpayer funding for religious education. How has that changed over the last decade or two in terms of a topic in front of the Supreme Court and what they do this past term?
I'm going to answer your question in reverse order. Nothing. And in past terms, the Supreme Court has been much more tolerant of money, public money involved in education. Whether it's public money to repair the playground at a religious school, or public money to send students to schools that offer a religious education. But the case that came to the Supreme Court this past term came from Oklahoma, where a Catholic organization wanted to offer a taxpayer-funded, online, explicitly religious education. So it was the first time that the Supreme Court has ever confronted the question of, okay, it's one thing to give the money to the parents, it's another thing to give the money to the playground. But what about giving the money directly to a school that's going to offer an explicitly sectarian education? And the Supreme Court, I said, nothing is the answer to the question, because what happened here is Amy Coney Barrett, who used to teach at Notre Dame, there was some Notre Dame involvement in the case in the lower, when it worked its way through the lower court, so she recused, she took herself off the case. That left only 8 justices. There was a 4-4 tie. And when there's a tie like that, the lower court decision stands. There's no precedent. It's as though the Supreme Court never heard the case. The lower courts had decided against the Catholic school. So they've since decided to try to come up with some other way to raise the money, and they're not asking for public money. Now, because of the peculiarity in how this case came to the court with Amy Coney Barrett recusing, there's the possibility that it could come back, some other program. And if there's if no other recusal issues come, then you'd have the full 9 justices. And you have the question of whether the court would endorse that. As I say, in recent years, the wall of separation between church and state has been coming down, case after case after case. Are they ready to say taxpayer funding of religious education is okay? I don't know. I don't think the court is ready to say you can require students in public schools to say prayers. I don't think the court is ready to walk that one back. But I don't know. In a couple of years, this question is going to come back up, and I couldn't predict how it would come out.
And notably, the Oklahoma State Superintendent, Ryan Walters, actually resigned last week to take another position. So that particular example may not be
well, and what was interesting about Oklahoma is that the state attorney general and the governor disagreed about this.
Correct, yeah. He's very unpopular there, and they're all happy he resigned. But
those of you who don't know Colin knows that he cares a lot about Oklahoma, having done some of his work there.
Yes, I spent 7 years there, and that
Spent 7 years there one night. That's an old joke.
Yeah, well, legally allows me to say all y'all like once or twice a semester. Pete, you know that I'm an elections nerd.
And just a general nerd, I would say.
Well, thank you. And when I was in Oklahoma, I actually was in charge of redistricting the state, particularly the state house lines. I worked in the congressional districts and other things. The Voting Rights Act was one thing that we had to keep in mind as we were dealing with that redraw after the 2010 census. Now, we know Section 5 has gone through some changes legally, but what about Section 2?
Yeah, Section 5 has gone through the same kind of changes that happens when you die. It is at dead level. It no longer has any effect. So, I guess the best way to talk about this, we spend a little time on this with your forbearance, since you love politics.
I appreciate it.
There was an ancient folk remedy for a toothache. You had to run around a church 3 times without thinking of a fox. True. And the law on redistricting and race is a little bit like that. Because what the current state of the law says to legislatures is this. When you're redrawing boundaries after the census, which happens every 10 years, and the population shift, and you have to redraw the boundaries for your state legislature, and if you have more than one member of Congress for your Congress, you have to keep 2 things in mind. On the one hand, you can't do anything to dilute the voting strength of minority voters. You can't erect new boundaries that make it harder for them to elect the candidates of their choice. And of course, the law has come to this point from a long and sad history where southern states did that before breakfast. So it definitely was something that the Supreme Court had to deal with. And so the courts look at whether 2 things are happening. Are they taking the minority voters and sprinkling them around so that they can't form a majority, which is called cracking? Or are they taking the minority voters rather, and sort of drawing the boundaries to jam them all into one district, which is called packing, so that they only get, a single district? Packing and cracking. All right, so Section 5, which Colin talked about, of the Voting Rights Act, which was a landmark piece of federal legislation, said in states with a history of discrimination, they couldn't change their voting methods at all. Couldn't move a polling place, couldn't change the date of the election, couldn't change the election hours without getting permission first. It's a process called pre-clearance. And you got that either by going to the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division, or a special 3-judge panel of federal judges. So you had to get permission in advance. That was Section 5. That's gone. The Supreme Court a couple of years ago said, you know what, we don't need it anymore. Things are better now, never mind. So that left Section 2, which says after a state makes a change, you can then sue and claim it's discriminatory and it erects new boundaries to voting. So the power of Section 5 is that you had to get permission, the state had to persuade the court or the Justice Department first that it would not harm minority voters. So the burden was on the state. Section 2, the burden is on the people challenging what the state has done. So it's a much higher burden, it's a much more difficult burden to face, but it's pretty much all that's left now in Section 2. All right, so the case comes from Louisiana, which was redistricting, and it's a state that has a minority population of 30%. It's about a third black voters. It has 6 congressional districts. So you would think, okay, well, then probably there are 2 black districts. Well, not according to the Louisiana legislature. They gave 1 district in which blacks had a majority. That was challenged by black voters. The federal court said to the Louisiana legislature, that's not going to work. Try again. So the legislature said, okay, we'll create 2 districts in which black voters have the majority. That was challenged by white voters who said, well, you just are racially gerrymandering. And you can't do that. So the Supreme Court heard arguments in this case last term and couldn't reach a decision. So they've ordered it re-argued for this coming term. But they've added a new question. They've added the question of basically, does this kind of racial consciousness violate the Constitution? In other words, the Supreme Court is saying that it might consider striking down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act as well, which would leave very little of it left. I mean, I don't think they'll strike it down entirely, but they might erect new barriers to make it even harder to win a Section 2 case. And there's one other footnote here, Colin. There's a case from North Dakota involving Native Americans that raised similar objections to redistricting in North Dakota. The Native Americans in the states where there are tribes have had a long history of, trying to make it harder for Native Americans to vote. Little things like you have to have a home address, and many tribes don't have home addresses where they live. Things like that. The Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals said, you know what? Only states can file lawsuits under Section 2. Now, if the Supreme Court were to adopt that, that means no more lawsuits from black voters, no more lawsuits from the NAACP. That would really make it hard to use Section 2 to fight discrimination in voting. So, there's a lot riding on these Voting Rights Act cases.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. It is 8 o'clock. What I want to do is spend some time getting some questions from the audience. So students, alumni, if you have a question, please, we have a question right here. Yes?
Pete, could you talk a little bit about the effect of the presidential immunity decision on the court today and its impact on what we're seeing in politics?
Yeah, the question was, what impact does the Supreme Court's decision from last term on saying that the presidents have immunity from criminal prosecution had on what we're going through now? Almost everything. I think the president feels very emboldened by that decision. Remember what the Supreme Court said was that you can't prosecute a president, you can't make it a crime if a president is acting within the boundaries of his core constitutional responsibilities. So, for example, the president telling the Attorney General, go prosecute Jim Comey, he has a right to talk to his Attorney General. You can't prosecute him for that. It's, I think, emboldened him from that. What it said is, you can't prosecute him for when he acts within the boundaries of his core constitutional authority. When it's ambiguous, when there could be authority from Congress, but it's not clear, then there's a rebuttable presumption that he's acting properly and you can't prosecute him. But if he's acting outside the scope of his authorities, beyond his power of president, then he can be prosecuted. Not only does I think that make the president feel, I'm home free, I think it also reflects the attitude within the Supreme Court, how total executive power is. And that's why I think it's safe to predict that they're going to overturn this Humphreys executor case and say, yeah, presidents can fire people on these independent federal agencies for whatever reason. They don't have to state a reason. They can do whatever they want. I'll just say one little footnote on this. In the Supreme Court, in the past decisions saying, yes, you can go ahead and fire members of these independent bodies, did say in a footnote, but the Federal Reserve is different. And we're going to find out how different it is because, as you know, he's fired a member, he wants to fire a member named Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve Board. She's challenging her firing on 2 grounds. She's saying, and the president's being a bit crafty here. He's saying, well, I am firing her for cause because she was trying to fool the mortgage applications. She filed 2 mortgage applications and she said both were her home address. Now, there's a lot of indication that that is not what she did, but in any event, she did it before she got on the Federal Reserve Board. And so, is that cause? If it was an action before she came on the Federal Reserve? He says yes, because it casts doubt on her veracity and trustworthiness. But we'll see how that shakes out too.
I'm glad I don't own two homes. Brad.
So I'm a practicing lawyer. I am very intrigued, not necessarily positively or negatively, by the idea of broadcast licenses being revoked from major news networks, which we're starting to hear more about. And I'm just curious, I tried to look up what the licensing standard even is. I think the allegation is they're biased, they're committing fraud, they're lying, whatever. I can't even tell what the standard is. I don't know if you know what the standard is, and if you feel like any of the major networks the last 10, 20 years have flirted with it, or that would actually warrant.
Well, of course, it affects the major networks only insofar as it affects their affiliated stations. So the networks themselves are not licensed. It's their stations that are licensed by the FCC. So this would not apply to, for example, MSNBC or Fox News or CNN, because they're not broadcasting. It's only over the air broadcasters. So it's the local stations. It's Channel 3 here. It's the Fox station that Joe Toohey works for that was here last night. And what the standard is, the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That's what the Communications Act of 1934 says. And you can challenge, and it happens. If a community group thinks that a station is not acting in the public interest, they can challenge the license. And it used to be that happened every now and then, where a station that made promises, give us a license, we're going to do lots of community affairs programming. We're going to broadcast Little League baseball games. We're going to have, live coverage of the city council. We're going to have regular public affairs programming. And then they don't do any of that. Then the community groups can challenge the license, and the FCC can take the license away and give it to someone else. Needless to say, broadcast licenses are worth a lot of money. And so the problem here is that Brendan Carr, who's the chairman of the FCC, is threatening to take away broadcast licenses from stations, for example, that were carrying Jimmy Kimmel's show, which is a clear violation of the First Amendment. That is government restricting free expression. The president himself has made similar comments that, we ought to take the licenses away from NBC because they hate me and all that kind of stuff. So I can't imagine that if Brendan Carr tried to take a license away from an ABC affiliate somewhere because they covered Jimmy Kimmel's show, that would ever survive in court. But, it would be a pain for the station to have to fight that. He has no authority to do that whatsoever. It's an outrageous suggestion.
Additional questions?
So you talked earlier about the shadow ballot, and you mentioned...
Shadow docket.
Shadow docket,
Yeah.
sorry. And you mentioned about Humphrey's executor and how lower courts kind of have a glimpse of how the Supreme Court's going to decide on that precedent, but it hasn't been set in stone that they're getting rid of it. So how does the lower court end up interpreting a precedent that might end up being overturned?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And are you a law student?
Yeah.
Okay, just go get your license right now. You're clearly ready. You don't need this law school stuff. That's good thinking. Okay. So it puts the lower courts in a tough spot because, let's see, I've got some language here from Elena Kagan in this whole question of whether you can fire commissioners from these independent agencies. So what happened was this woman named Rebecca Slaughter was a member of the Federal Trade Commission. And she was originally appointed in the first Trump administration by Donald Trump. She was reappointed by Joe Biden. Her term should have ended in 2029, but then this year Trump wanted to fire her. So she went to court, and the lower court said, no, you can't fire her. But the Supreme Court said, no, we're going to put that on hold. Go ahead and fire her. And made it pretty clear that meant it was going to overturn Humphrey's executor, that this 90-year-old precedent was toast. In her dissent, here's what Elena Kagan said about that. She said the majority may be raring to overturn, it was the term she used, raring to overturn Humphrey's executor. Now I'll quote, but until the deed is done, that earlier case controls and should prevent the majority from giving the president the unlimited removal power that Congress denied him. The emergency docket should never be used to permit what the court's precedent bars. It shouldn't be used to transfer government authority from Congress to the president and thus to reshape the separation of powers. We shouldn't be doing that on the emergency docket. We shouldn't be implicitly overturning precedent. But what the justices seem to be saying is, read my lips. We don't think Humphrey's executor is good law anymore. So, don't be giving stays to people who sue because they've been fired by the president and citing Humphrey's executor. That's a dead letter. That shouldn't be happening on the emergency docket. It seems to be happening on the emergency docket. I mean, we're seeing a lot of stuff on this shadow docket that has never happened before.
We've got time for about one more question. Who wants it?
You scared everyone. That question was so good.
From an undergrad of all people.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question. What was that other campaign spending case that the Supreme Court's going to hear? I'm glad you asked that question.
Thank you.
Because it comes from Ohio. This is a case that challenges the current limit on the extent to which a political party can spend money to support a candidate in coordination with the candidate. Okay? There are limits on how much money a political party can spend to do that. J.D. Vance, when he was running for re-election, and then Congressman Steve Chabot joined the Republican Party in challenging that limitation. They said, well, that's a limitation on our free expression. Money is expression. Money buys speech. Money buys ads. Now, the Supreme Court had this exact same question in a case from Colorado a couple of terms ago, and what they said is, no, actually, that limitation is a good thing because it discourages vote buying, it discourages corruption, it discourages political parties essentially laundering money through the campaigns and evading the campaign expenditure limits. So that's a good thing to have. The fact that the court agreed to take this case indicates, I think it's a pretty strong indication that it may be ready to overturn that limitation.
Interesting. Well, we all would like to thank you for attending our event tonight. We hope that the undergraduates have been able to network with some of you alumni and current law students. There is still time for undergraduates. If you can talk to somebody, ask questions. This is a really good opportunity, and I know that the alumni are grateful for being able to share their wisdom because they've gone through where you were. So take advantage of this. Undergrads, also grab some pizza and water from the back. I know you all are hungry. And again, thank you for being here. If you have any questions for Pete, come on up and ask him as well. Thank you.